Sometimes we need some inspirational stories to remind ourselves of why we got into our career in the first place. In the MedSLP world, there are tons of inspirational stories. If you're a member of the MedSLP Collective, you could just search the word win in the private Facebook group and spend hours and days reading real-world experiences that stir up all the feel-good emotions inside of you. Today, I'm going to share 3 inspirational stories of MedSLPs changing people's lives and showing the world why they do what they do. Let's dive in. I'm Theresa Richard. I've been a medical speech pathologist for 15 years. I'm a board-certified specialist in swallowing and swallowing disorders. I'm the founder and CEO of the MedSLP Collective and MedSLP Education. Number 1, the woman with aphasia who wanted to give a wedding speech. Aphasia, which is a communication impairment that results from damage to certain portions of the brain, can show up in many different ways. A person with aphasia might have greater difficulty with expressing language than they do with understanding language, or people with aphasia might experience difficulty with both meaningful expressive language and the ability to comprehend language. This can show up in speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Lauren, an SLP friend and colleague of mine, has shared an incredible story in a book she wrote about our profession titled, "But My Speech is Fine," and has given me permission to share it here. It's too good not to share. The story is about a patient she worked with who had aphasia from an old stroke and showed up to her office with one goal in mind: to give a speech at a family member's wedding reception. This patient, who is referred to as Svetlana in But My Speech is Fine, had survived a stroke several years prior to showing up to the outpatient clinic Lauren worked in. She was independently mobile and had no hemiparesis. Just by looking at her, you couldn't tell she had a stroke. The only telltale sign of her past stroke was her expressive aphasia. However, she had developed several fluent phrases she would rely on in an attempt to hide her aphasia or get out of completing her spoken thoughts, like, "You know what I mean." It frustrated her whenever her husband would attempt to complete her sentences for her, or when servers at restaurants would turn their gaze to her husband to order for her when she got stuck on a word. She never wanted to give up therapy, but prior physicians had told her that this was her new norm, and she likely wouldn't continue to improve several years after her stroke, which couldn't be farther from the truth. It wasn't until she demanded outpatient therapy services that she showed up to Lauren's office. At first, her speech sounded fluent. It wasn't until she was maybe 5 minutes into the assessment that Lauren started to notice more communication breakdowns. She shared with Lauren that her one big goal was to give a speech at her brother's upcoming wedding reception. She wanted to surprise her family, who had always been so supportive of her and her goals. Together, they put in the work. Lauren asked Svetlana to bring in family photos and any other memorabilia that could act as a guide for the speech Svetlana wanted to give. This also helped Lauren keep track of who was who and acted as cues for Svetlana when communication breakdowns were beginning to affect the accuracy of the speech. Each session was dedicated to writing at least one paragraph of the speech. Lauren guided Svetlana in structuring the talking points and discussed visual strategies to help Svetlana read each word correctly. They used large font, substituted longer, more complex words for simpler words, and spelled some words phonetically. For example, educated became taught, and taught was spelled out as T-O-T. These strategies slowly built up Svetlana's confidence, but as the wedding day was quickly approaching, she started to doubt herself. She was still getting hung up on words and felt fatigued by the time she would reach the end of the speech, exacerbating her word blocks. The only strategy that seemed to help was when Lauren would say the word out loud and Svetlana would repeat it, since her repetition was relatively intact. Lauren suggested that Svetlana's sister stand at the podium with her, and whenever she got too hung up on a word, her sister could quietly say the word to Svetlana so she could repeat it. That felt good to Svetlana. As the day of the reception approached, Svetlana asked Lauren a question that almost left her speechless. She asked if she would come to the wedding reception. Svetlana's brother knew she was working with Lauren and was so excited to see the progress in her expressive language, so he extended the invitation to the SLP who had been helping her. Like I said, her family was extremely supportive of Svetlana in all of her work. And of course, Lauren accepted the invitation. The wedding day finally approached, and Lauren arrived solo to the event. While looking for Svetlana, she met her sister, who immediately gave her a hug upon finding out who Lauren was. That's when Lauren was met with a second invitation that nearly left her speechless, to stand at the podium next to Svetlana during her speech. Surprised and humbled, Lauren accepted. Finally came time for Svetlana to give her speech. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Many family members were surprised to see her up there with a microphone in hand. Once Svetlana introduced herself and briefly explained that she had survived a stroke that impacted her speech, asking the audience to please be patient with her, Several of her family members were already quietly crying with what appeared to be tears of joy. She already sounded so much better than they had remembered. As she moved through her speech that she and Lauren had worked so hard in preparing and practiced daily, more tears began to sweep the room. She shared stories of her brother and new sister-in-law, creating an atmosphere of nostalgia and warmth. Svetlana had nearly 80% of her speech done when she started to show some fatigue and increased verbal breakdowns. She was requiring more and more time to complete a sentence, and Lauren could tell she wanted to give up. She had reached the very last paragraph when she paused, looked at Lauren, and said, "Here, you finish," while pointing the microphone towards Lauren. Lauren knew what Svetlana was capable of and quietly encouraged her to keep going, that she was right there with her. Then something incredible happened. Guests and family members started to cheer her on, saying things like, "You got this, and you can do it." With an entire room of support, Svetlana took a deep breath and slowly worked her way through the final 4 sentences. As soon as she said her final word, she looked up and the entire room was giving her a standing ovation. Her brother walked up to her to give her a hug, tears streaming down his face. Lauren actually got to witness her goal being met. This is one of the biggest moments in her career that solidified why she ever chose to be an SLP to begin with. Number 2, the bedbound patient who relied on tube feeds, until one SLP showed up. MedSLPs can offer life-changing services and even reduce the cost of healthcare. One member of the MedSLP Collective proved this to a new skilled nursing facility that she had been transferred to. Prior to her arrival, there wasn't a consistent SLP working there, so she was the sole SLP for that facility. This tends to be a common reality for many SLPs who work in nursing homes. Luckily, that same facility got a fees contract the same week she transferred there. This is where she made the life-changing decision to go through every single long-term care resident that was on an altered diet and see what was actually going on with their swallow using fees. 5 of the residents she had fees done with were on puree and thickened liquids for years. That's years of a reduced quality of life, increased risk of UTI if they choose not to drink as much due to disliking the consistency, and years of an increased cost to the facility who had to keep up with buying thickener. Because of her fees initiative, it was discovered that all of them had a safe and functional swallow, and every single one of them moved to a regular diet texture with thin liquids. By the time she shared the story with us, she had upgraded 20 altered diets. Here was the best part of her story. There was one man who was bedbound and on thickened liquids with puree and tube feeds as his primary source of nutrition. This SLP was able to not only get him off tube feeds, but she also got him back on regular food and on PTOT services to get him out of bed every day for most of the day. Prior to this, his daughter had a hard time visiting him because it made her too sad. Because of these changes, however, his daughter and wife were now visiting him often. When the SLP finally got to meet his extended family, they told her that his progress was a Christmas miracle, and everyone wanted to meet the angel that came into his life and turned him around. Talk about tears and goosebumps. This collective member ended her win by saying that this reminded her of why we do what we do and encouraged the rest of us to keep pushing and advocating for our patients. After a story like that, how could we not be motivated? I'll be posting other videos just like this one that you won't want to miss, so make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Do you have any stories that made you think, this is why I do what I do? Leave a comment below and tell me about it. We'll be sure to get your questions answered as soon as possible. Make sure to stick around to the end to claim a freebie or 2. Number 3. The third and final story is extremely personal to me as it involves my own son. I was working with patients with swallowing disorders when the universe delivered to me a little boy who landed in the NICU with feeding and swallowing disorders. To say I felt lost and overwhelmed would be an understatement, as I had all of this knowledge of adults and geriatrics, but very little on peds, let alone a tiny baby. We had a rough start in his first few years of his feeding journey as we struggled to find SLPs with knowledge of his condition and delays. But once we found our dream team, everything changed for him and our family dynamic. To be honest, I had no idea how much this would impact our entire family and meal times and how much it mattered to have an SLP that really truly cared about our entire family dynamic at meal times and not just the muscles in his mouth. The SLPs that we've worked with for my son have changed the way I practice and look at patients forever. We had one SLP who asked more about our family mealtime traditions and his medical history, and at first I was confused, maybe even annoyed. But now I realize how important all of these pieces fit together for long-term successes and adherence to a therapy program. She wanted to ensure that the goals we had for therapy were able to be assimilated into our family. Another SLP that we had has been relentless about the delicate balance between compensatory strategies and exercises. She worked very hard on exercises during therapy, but ensured that we had proper strategies to ensure safe and efficient meal times at home. She changed the plan many times, but I always had so much respect for her in not sticking to what does work for longer than necessary. We tried many different cups and straws and finally landed on success for my son, which is the ultimate goal. She taught me so much about being steadfast in the approach but flexible in the methods, and I'm so grateful for those lessons as both an SLP and the lasting impact it has had on my son's independence, improved nutritional status, and our family's ability to have meals together. Want to find more inspiration through the lens of a medical SLP? Make sure you follow us on Instagram at MedSLP_collective. You can click the link to follow us down in the description. We love sharing day in the life posts that outline what SLPs across different settings do in any given day, hour by hour. You can also check out my book, So You're Having Trouble Swallowing, on Amazon or other book retailers, which was written for patients but gives a glimpse into my experience with my son and why I'm so passionate about educating patients to advocate for their own care. Also, check out Lauren Herman's book, But My Speech is Fine: Speech-Language Pathology, True Stories of a Misunderstood Profession, for more feel-good stories about this amazing profession.